Hello everyone, welcome to A Good Night for a Murder, a Victorian true crime podcast. My name is Kim, and tonight's case is about an early American serial killer whose crimes and reign of terror rival that of Jack the Ripper. This is the story of the Texas Servant Girl Annihilator. But first, a Victorian society tip. Springtime is wedding season, so I've compiled a list of Victorian wedding lore and superstitions. First, for those ladies hoping to be married one day, never leave church with the man that you hope to marry. It's been said that as they have walked back from church together before they are married, they will never walk back from church together as man and wife. In planning your wedding, the month of the year mattered as well as the day of the week. I'll post the entire poem on my blog, but for now, I will tell you that spring and fall months were not favorable. Winter and summer months were the preferred months, including this month, the month of June, which states, married in the month of roses, June, life will be one long honeymoon. So far as days of the week, the saying went, Monday for health, Tuesday for wealth, Wednesday the best day of all, Thursday for losses, Friday for crosses, and Saturday no luck at all. Now, wedding dresses weren't always traditionally white. That became a trend when Queen Victoria chose to wear a white dress for her own wedding. After that, Godey's Ladies Book, which was the most widely circulated monthly ladies magazine in the mid-1800s, published an article promoting white as the traditional color for brides due to its ancient history representing purity and innocence. Not that was necessarily true, though. They were just jumping on board the white wedding dress trend. But we fell for it, apparently, because over 180 years later, we're still primarily wearing white wedding gowns. Before this, though, brides and their bridesmaids just wore the best dress they owned as their wedding gown. Those were usually not white. What's more, before the white dress trend, wealthier women who were having a dress made had a choice in the color of their wedding dress. Dress color held its own superstition as well. For example, blue meant love will be true, and pink meant of you he'll always think. Now, it was said much of the newlyweds' fate would be determined just by matter of circumstance on the day of the wedding. For example, a sunny day was a good omen, but rain was bad. But snow was good. Finding a spider on the bride's dress was also said to be a good omen, as well as hearing a robin sing in the morning. If you arrive at the church to find an uncovered open grave in the churchyard, that was very bad luck. Also, if something breaks in the morning of the wedding, that's a sign the bride will not get along with her new husband's family. It was also said that the bride should not look at herself in her final wedding ensemble before the ceremony, or else it would bring bad luck. Now, if she really needed to, though, she can add one more accessory to the final look right before walking down the aisle, thus changing the final ensemble and reversing any bad luck. The tradition of the bride and groom not seeing one another the night before the wedding also originates from this time, though it was for a very different reason. This stems from when arranged marriages were common. The bride and the groom would be kept from one another until the final event to be sure the marriage would go through. Another one you likely know is the rhyme something old, something new, something borrowed, something blue, and a sixpence in your shoe. This also originated out of Victorian England. So far as the wedding guests and bridal party, if a bridesmaid stumbled on her way down the aisle, that woman would never be wed. Alternatively, the guest who got the biggest piece of cake at the wedding would be the next to marry. Few quick announcements, then we'll head into the story. So first off, I have enabled ads for the podcast this season. Season 1 had no ads, but that's super unusual for a podcast to be completely ad-free. I do this podcast all on my own, all the researching, editing, scheduling, website, social media, all of it. And I do pay hosting fees and storage fees, so if I can get a little help with that, why not? And I promise I'm not getting rich off these ads. The way that they work is the hosting platform I use inserts them into my episodes, and when they fulfilled their allotted number of plays, the ad disappears. So sometimes you might hear them, sometimes you might not. But if you want to make sure your episodes are always ad-free, I have added ad-free audio as a benefit on Patreon. Ad-free episodes are available to the $5 housekeeper and butler tier members on Patreon. Additionally, I've also added episode transcripts as a benefit to the $3 a month and $5 a month tier. So there are 3 levels of support in all on Patreon. There's the $1 a month, which is the chambermaid and footman tier. If you're enjoying the podcast or recognize how much work goes into it, especially for one person, this is a great way to show support. The only benefit here is my eternal thanks. The $3 a month tier is the ladies maid and valet tier. That gets you a shout out, a sticker, and now the episode transcripts that we just talked about. And the $5 a month tier is the housekeeper and butler tier, and that gets you everything in the $3 tier, plus a handwritten Victorian thank you postcard, ad-free episodes we just talked about, plus the bonus content. I release episodes every other week, and each comes with a bonus content episode that is exclusively on Patreon for housekeeper and butler tier members. It's usually an extension or related story to the regular episode. At the end of each regular episode, I share what the bonus content is. It's available the same day that the regular episode drops, and in Season 2, I've added previews of the bonus content all the way at the end of each episode after the outro music plays. So listen through the theme song, wait for the thunder crash, then you can hear the preview. In case you didn't notice, I named the Patreon tiers in order of the hierarchy of domestic servants in the Victorian household: chambermaid and footman, lady's maid and valet, then housekeeper and butler. Not that anyone who joins at a lower tier is any less than someone else. I was just super pleased with myself when I came up with those names, and I wanted you to know about it. One more thing before we get on with the story. A Good Night for a Murder is on YouTube now. I'm not making videos of myself talking or anything. It's just audio in a cool waveform for now. But if YouTube is a place you like to get podcasts, you can find me there now too. All new episodes will be posted there as they're released, and I'm also in the process of uploading all of Season 1. So you can head over there, subscribe to my channel. Even if you don't watch podcasts on YouTube, getting more subscribers will help boost the channel on that platform, and I will be forever grateful. You can find the link in the episode description here, also on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. Now, on to the story. A Good Night for a Murder is a true crime podcast that does cover stories including death, violence, sexual assault, and other adult themes. Please take care while listening. It started the morning of December 31st, 1884. About 9 a.m., a call was patched into the Austin, Texas Police Department that simply stated, Dr. Steiner reports a woman lying near Raby's store and wishes an officer sent out to take charge. The next-door neighbor's servant spotted what he thought was a dead animal near the outhouse on the neighboring property. It was not an animal, though. It was a person. The body was that of 25-year-old Molly Smith. Molly was a black domestic servant employed by a wealthy white family. She lived in a small servant's quarters with her boyfriend, Walter Spencer, who also worked for the family. A blood trail indicated she'd been struck in the head with an axe, dragged outside where she was sexually assaulted, and then stabbed all over her body. When the undertaker came for her, he had to essentially pick her up in pieces. The night before, during the wee hours of the morning, boyfriend Walter had woke with a start in agony, having been struck in the head. As he came to his senses, he realized the room had been trashed and Molly's side of the bed was covered in blood. But Molly was missing. Bleeding from the head, he made his way to the main house that was being looked after by his employer's brother-in-law, and he begged for help to find Molly. The brother-in-law turned him away, though, saying he couldn't help him, but Walter ought to go bandage his head. Austin was experiencing a bit of a cold snap that week, and the last thing he wanted to do was go out into the snow and look for a missing black girl. So he went back to bed. Having gotten no help from the main house, Walter ran a few doors down to Dr. Steiner, who helped him bandage his bleeding head, and who also sent him on his way. He staggered around searching for Molly for a while before, having completely exhausted himself, made his way to his brother's house. Now, of course, Walter was interrogated as a suspect, but everyone who knew he and Molly, including the doctor and his employer's brother-in-law who had neglected to help him, attested to his innocence. It was thought that a jealous ex-lover of Molly's was the next best suspect, a man named Lem Brooks. But he seemed pretty innocent as well. No evidence could be found linking him to Molly's murder, and by all accounts, he was far from a jealous ex-lover. In fact, he was on amicable terms with the couple. Ultimately, his case was dismissed due to lack of evidence. The city of Austin at the time was enjoying a bit of a boom. In the 1860s, Austin was just another quiet western town with a population of barely 5,000. By the mid-1880s, though, the population had rapidly increased to nearly 145,000 residents and boasted numerous restaurants and hotels. It was described as on the verge of modernity, and a stately new Capitol building was under construction. While Austin was quickly transforming from a sleepy cowtown to a bustling city, it only handled about 4 to 5 murder cases a year, and most of those happened during a random bar fight. They were certainly nothing like the murder of Molly Smith. Despite the brutality of the case, though, the citizens of Austin largely viewed it as a black-on-black crime that didn't really affect them. And life went on as usual, for a short while anyway. Starting in March, a string of bizarre attacks were carried out on the servant women of Austin. A young servant girl from Germany, I'm presuming white, awoke one night to see what she first thought was a ghost standing beside her. This figure stared down at her for minutes before suddenly saying, "Your money or your life." She screamed, he struck her in the head with a hard object and fled. 4 nights later, a black cook employed in a physician's home was awoken by a violent shaking of the locked door to her quarters. When she looked out, she saw no one, but an hour later, not far away, another report came in of someone trying to enter the locked door of 2 black servant women. One of the women opened the door and stepped outside to see what was going on when someone grabbed her from behind. But she made such a commotion, her assailant released her and fled. She and her roommate were too frightened to spend the rest of the night there, so they slept in the kitchen of their employer's house that night. Upon returning to their quarters the next day, they found their room had been ransacked. 2 nights after that, in the dead of night, the home of another black servant woman was broken into while she slept. The intruder, quote, tearing the covers off her bed and several times striking her on the head and face. Then they vanished back into the night. Later that month, another attack. This time on 2 white servant girls who were awoken by a tapping on their window. The girls were too petrified to move, but then a bullet was shot through their window and into the wall. The girls leaped out of bed and started running for the main house, but someone grabbed one of them from behind. Their screams woke everyone in the main house, who ran out to search the property. While this was going on, the girls returned to their cabin and barricaded the door, only to have another shot fired, again straight through the window, where this time it hit one of the girls in the back. They were unable to find the shooter, though. But then things go quiet for about 2 months. Until the morning of May 7, 1885. The wife of Dr. Lucian Johnson heard screaming erupt from the cabin on her property where their domestic servant, Eliza Shelley, lived with her 3 small children. Instead of looking into the matter herself, she sent her young niece, described as barely a teenager, to go look in on the Shelleys. Moments later, she hears her niece start screaming as well, after which she bursts back through the door and collapses in her aunt's arms, so beside herself that she can't even speak. Now, Dr. Johnson himself had stepped out that morning to run errands. Mrs. Johnson waits until he arrives home and then sends him out back to the Shelleys' cabin, where he finds the 3 young boys huddled in a corner and the body of Eliza wrapped in a quilt on the floor. On sight, he can tell she suffered a violent wound to her right temple. 2 trunks containing mostly Eliza's clothes have been broken into and their contents scattered about the cabin. Authorities are called and Eliza's body is moved outside for closer inspection. She had a stab wound between her eyes that seemed to have been made with something like a screwdriver, and her body was covered in deep stab wounds. Now, Eliza's oldest son was 7, and he and his 2 younger brothers had been asleep in the same bed with their mother that night. The 2 younger boys at one end with Eliza and the oldest at the other end. He said that a stranger wearing a white rag with eye holes cut out shook him awake in the middle of the night and demanded to know where his mother kept her money. He said he didn't think she had any money. The man then told him to put his head under the pillow and not move, otherwise he would kill him. He also told him he would be gone on the next morning train to St. Louis. The boy did as the man said, and he fell back asleep. The 2 younger boys never woke up until morning. He said he couldn't tell if the man was black or white, but when pressed, he guessed more likely white. Now, no one wants to believe this story. It sounds crazy to them, but a reporter who pulled the boy aside right after the authorities were done speaking with him said the boy retold the same story multiple times, never wavering in his version of events. The only other evidence immediately present is a set of, quote, large, broad, barefoot tracks leading to and from the Shelley residence, then away down a back alley. Despite the boy being unable to identify the intruder's race, authorities decided the person they're looking for is a barefoot black male. A few hours later, they happened across Andrew Williams, a boy of 19 who lived nearby and just happened to be black and shoeless. They brought him in for questioning, but his footprints were clearly the wrong size, and again, no arrest was made. Police thought they got a break in Eliza Shelley's case when they received a tip about a man Eliza had a brief relationship with while her husband was in prison. They rounded him up too, but again, the footprints did not match, there was no blood found on any of his belongings, and no one would corroborate the tipster's story. Newspapers started to run headlines like, "Inhabitants of the capital city are again shocked by a blood-curdling murder. A mother butchered in the presence of her children." Also, hold on, I need to take a breath for this one. "Foul fiends keep up their wicked work. Another woman cruelly murdered at dead of night by some unknown assassin bent on plunder. Another deed of deviltry in the crimson catalog of crime." Now, even though we have 5 black women and 3 white women who were targeted, these crimes are largely viewed as a problem for the black community. One theory put forward was the murders were being committed by a gang of black men, their motive being that a local black laborers union was trying to recruit servant women to their cause of raising wages and murdering those who refused to sign up. The black community themselves, though, were whispering of demons or evil spirits possessing someone to commit those murders. Some residents were practitioners of hoodoo and took to performing protective rituals or made protective charms, powders, and tonics for women to drink. Black servant women did their best to protect themselves by stacking furniture against their doors and windows at night. The city was very much on edge. And rightfully so, because a little over 2 weeks later, it happened again. On the evening of May 22nd, the local shoemaker hears low moaning sounds of someone in pain coming from his backyard. The moans quickly escalate to hysterical, piercing screams, and everyone rushes outside to try and find out what is going on. The family finds their 33-year-old black cook, Irene Cross, laying on the ground. Her right arm was nearly cut in half, and she had a long horizontal cut to her head as if someone had attempted to scalp her. She attempts to speak to them, but there's so much blood running down her face, she can't get any words out. They bring her inside to a spare bedroom in the main house and bandage up her arm and head as best they can. While this is going on, they ask her, "Who did this to you?" But Irene is too injured to speak. Irene makes it through the night, and by now, the news has spread all over Austin. People have lined up outside the house to walk past the window of the bedroom where Irene was laying. Bringing an injured servant into the main house was considered a significant act of generosity, by the way. The only witness was, again, a child. This time, it was Irene's 12-year-old nephew who saw a man enter the two-room cabin with a knife. He spoke to him, and he said to keep quiet and he wasn't there to hurt him. Then he went into Irene's room and was only in there a few moments before he ran out the cabin's back door. The boy described him as wearing a wide-brimmed cloth hat, a raggedy coat, a blue shirt, pants rolled up past his ankles, and bare feet. 2 weeks later, on the evening of June 2nd, someone stuck a pistol in through an open window of the home of a University of Texas professor and shot a black servant woman in the arm. The professor himself gave chase, but he was fired on as well, and the assailant escaped. The same night, a large rock was thrown through the window of the servants' quarters where 2 women and 1 man were sleeping, all of them black. This attack was actually the second carried out against the women, as they were the same who had been targeted previously back in March. The only reason the man was sleeping there now as well was because they were so frightened. He also gave chase, but again, the assailant escaped. Around this time, William Sidney Porter, who will go on to become better known by his pen name as author O. Henry, wrote in a letter to a friend that life in Austin was, quote, fearfully dull, except for the frequent raids of the Servant Girl Annihilators who make things lively during the dead hours of the night. I can't find if this nickname appeared in the press or if it was even actually used at the time, but he did coin the nickname we use when we talk about this case today. The other reason I wanted to bring it up, though, is because he specifically wrote Servant Girl Annihilators. Investigators were convinced this cannot be the work of one person. They are positive this is the work of a gang or network of criminals. Or, at the very least, the work of a few has emboldened others to carry out their own acts of bloodlust. Either way, they always believe the suspects to be black. So, having no actual evidence or any good leads, authorities just start rounding up black men. They arrest them for things like vagrancy, disturbing the peace, or public intoxication. Their hope is that one or more of them might provide some useful information into this ongoing gang activity, or, even better, maybe they'll just happen to arrest those who are actually guilty in the process. In one instance, they made an example of a black man named Oliver Townsend who was a known chicken thief. They chained him to the floor and beat him with a rope whip, but he confessed to nothing and they released him. After this, men started walking about the streets with their arms held straight out, trying to show officers that they didn't have an axe or knife on their person. Some women straight up packed their things and left town. Those who couldn't took to spending their nights on the kitchen floors of the main houses they worked in, or they would barricade and lock themselves in their cabins at shutdown and hope and pray that they made it through the night. A lot of people believed the devil himself had come to Austin. But then, things fell quiet. And from mid-June clear through July, there was no nighttime disturbances or assaults aside from the usual bar fight. The reprieve would not last, though, because in the pre-dawn hours of Sunday, August 30th, homeowner Valentine Weed and his wife heard a moaning coming from inside their home. With shotgun in hand, he made his way to the kitchen where their 40-year-old black servant, Rebecca Ramey, and her 11-year-old daughter, Mary, had taken to sleeping for their safety. The moaning was coming from Rebecca, who had been struck in the head by a club laying nearby. The club had been packed inside with lead and sand, I'm presuming to make it heavier and do more damage. Rebecca was gravely injured, but Mary was nowhere to be seen. When they asked Rebecca where she was, she just shook her head. Homeowner Mr. Weed ran outside and hollered for his neighbor, Mr. Jacqua, and together the men made their way around the property to the tool shed where they found little Mary Ramey. Someone had sexually assaulted her and stabbed her in both ears with some sort of long metal rod. Despite this, she was still alive. Doctors were quickly called, but there was nothing they could do to help the girl, and she quietly passed away there in the shed. Her mother, Rebecca, did survive, but all she remembered was waking to see a man standing over them. She had tried to scream, but the second she opened her mouth, she was knocked out. Now, the person who has been in charge of these murder investigations all along is a man named Sergeant John Chenville. Chenville has a couple of bloodhounds he deploys at every site, though they've never seemed to do much good until today. They find some bare footprints in the mud where the dogs hit on a scent that they followed all the way to a nearby stable where a black man, locally known as River Bottom Tom, was sleeping. It was his job to operate the water cart that sprayed the streets to keep the dust down. They hauled him in and gave him the beating of a lifetime, but he swore up and down he knew nothing, so they let him go. They randomly arrest another black man that same day and gave him the same treatment, but again, he had no connection to the Ramey women, and they let him go too. One new clue was noted during this investigation, which was that from the footprints, they could tell the perpetrator had what they described as a peculiarly shaped toe on the right foot. About a month later, on the night of September 28th, W.B. Dunham, the publisher of the Texas Court Reporter, hears hollering coming from the servants' quarters on his property. Dunham's cook, Gracie Vance, lived in the quarters with her boyfriend, Orange Washington. Also staying with them were two other black women from a nearby property, Patsy Gibson and Lucina Body. They were all bunked up there together, assuming there was more safety in numbers. So homeowner Dunham hears shouting coming from the cabin and assumes it's the couple fighting, so he yells back for them to quiet down, and then he goes back to bed. But then he hears someone groaning, so he gets up to go investigate just in time to see Lucina stagger out of the cabin, disoriented and bleeding from the head. He tells her to make her way to the house and sees his neighbor coming out of his own home. He heard the commotion as well and has already alerted the police. Together, they enter the cabin and find Patsy unconscious and bleeding from the head, and Orange face down on the ground, murdered by an axe blow to the head with the axe on the nearby bed where Gracie should have been. But Gracie is nowhere to be found. Now, I'm as frustrated as anyone that they can't catch this guy, but I just want to take a moment to appreciate the scene where these events were set in. It was dark. It was dark, dark, dark at nighttime in 1885. Imagine you hear a commotion outside or inside your house and you have to get a lantern lit before you can even see what's going on. Today, in 2023, if you're startled awake by something in the middle of the night, even if your power is out, you're going to grab your phone or your flashlight that will give you at least a little bit of light in a matter of seconds. Not for these people. Even when the police arrive, they come tearing up on horseback. They have no spotlights or red and blue flashers. All they've got is a measly little lantern light like everyone else. So, in this black of night, they manage to spot a blood trail and follow it out into the neighboring yard, where one officer literally trips over the body of Gracie Vance. The men surround her with their lantern lights and see, to their horror, her face has literally been beaten in with a brick. The neighbor whose property they're on looks down from the back window and screams that she sees someone getting away. Officers fire random shots into the dark, some take off on foot, others rush back to get on their horses and give chase. And here's another thing about fighting crime in the Victorian era. They can't just call for backup. They have a manhunt on now. They had an actual sighting. And the best they could do is dash into town and try and find more men to join in the hunt. They can't radio to the town over to send reinforcements or anything. And they do try to find more men to help out, but like I said, it's the dead of night, and every home, hotel, business is locked up tight and shuttered for the night. As dawn breaks, police learn that earlier that year, Gracie had spurned the romantic advances of a man named Doc Wood in favor of Orange Washington. So they head off to haul him in. Now, if you're wondering why it seems like investigators are sort of refusing to see the big picture here, let me give you a little context into what we describe today as a serial killer. In 1885, investigators had no concept of what a serial killer was. The phrase serial killer, or actually serial murderer, didn't even appear anywhere until the 1930s. And that was by a German criminologist whose thinking was considered very ahead of his time. The term and concept of a serial killer didn't really eke out into the public vernacular until about the 1970s or 1980s. And the detectives and agents credited with that were still exploring the infant stages of criminal profiling that would even allow them to characterize someone as a serial killer. So while we can look back at historical cases and term them serial killers, it's because we know what to look for, right? Hindsight is 20/20. We can see all the similarities and we can theorize about motive because we have heaps and heaps of prior case analysis and psychological research to back it up. Police back then had none of that to stand on. They're just playing a big old game of whack-a-mole where for some reason, all these criminals have suddenly popped up in their town. And because most victims have been Black, and because of racism, they're sure it's the Black male population that is the problem. And if they can just lock up enough of them, their problem will be solved. So, they arrest Gracie's jilted lover, Doc Wood, but just the same as every other arrest, they're having trouble building a case against him, and he's released. And by now, the city of Austin is starting to lose its ever-loving mind. Citizens have been calling for a while now to hire more police forces. They're calling for the resignation of the chief of police, and they're calling for civilian vigilante committees. And friends, it's going to get worse before it gets better. On Christmas Eve, 1885, a night watchman for one of the outer neighborhoods comes galloping into the center of town and reports to the officers patrolling the town center that, quote, a woman has been chopped to pieces. It's Mrs. Hancock on Water Street. Now, this is unusual because Susan Hancock is not a young Black domestic servant. She is a 43-year-old wife of Moses Hancock, a well-off carpenter in the city. And she's white. Officers rush to the scene where they gather that the Hancock family were asleep, all in separate bedrooms. Moses was awakened by a sound just before midnight. When he went out to check on his wife in her bedroom, he found her clothes scattered all about the room, blood on the sill of an open window, and Susan is missing. He goes out into the yard where he finds his wife laying on the ground in a pool of blood. He spots movement out of the corner of his eye and sees someone slip over the back fence. His neighbor comes out, and together the men move Susan inside the house, but she was already gone. Her head had been split nearly in two with an axe and a sharp object jabbed through her right ear. The bloodhounds, again, pick up a scent where Moses saw someone escape out the back of the property, and everyone takes off in that direction. But the chase is short-lived as the dogs quickly lose the trail. As officers are scouring the Hancock's property for clues, for the second time that night, a messenger comes tearing up on horseback saying there's been another murder. It's Eula Phillips. Everyone is blindsided by this news. Eula Phillips is regarded as one of the most beautiful women in Austin. She is all of 17 years old and married to the young architect Jimmy Phillips. Like Susan, she is white as well. The Hancock and Phillips residence are all of 15 minutes apart. So, officers book it across town to the Phillips residence where they find Eula in her nightclothes with rollers in her hair, dead in the yard. She's been killed by an axe blow directly between her eyes. And it also seems like she's been posed with her arms outstretched and a few pieces of firewood placed on top of her body. Shortly after midnight, Eula's mother-in-law heard the couple's baby crying in the room. When she didn't hear anyone consoling the child, she went in herself to find the baby sitting up, unharmed, but her son was bleeding from a head wound and Eula was gone. She starts screaming for her husband, who goes and wakes up others in the neighborhood, and eventually they find Eula. Now, back in the 1880s, they had an early telephone service called Party Lines. This was like one phone line that connected everyone in the community. Anytime you wanted, you could pick up the receiver and listen in on whatever anyone was saying on there. And because they were often used for emergencies, it was a quick way to learn about whatever was going on in town. So, Austin residents are hearing the bloodhounds baying, the horses galloping all over town after midnight. They start picking up their party lines to try and find out what's going on. And panic quickly spreads through the entire city. Despite there being some early attacks on white women, most victims have been Black, and most residents view this as a problem with the Black community. But now, no one is safe. So, on Christmas Eve, men are yanking their wives and children out of bed and barricading them all into one room while they load their shotguns. Others, realizing they're no longer safe in their own homes, rouse their families out of bed and transport everyone downtown, grasping for any semblance of safety and demanding to know how the city is going to put a stop to this. Crowds stand around all night while officers struggle to maintain order, until dawn finally breaks and church bells toll the arrival of a very somber Christmas morning. As usual, there isn't much hard evidence present at either scene. One thing they do find is a bloody footprint on the wooden floorboards in the hall outside Eula and Jimmy's bedroom, which they cut out and take away. The footprint appears to be missing the right pinky toe, the same peculiarity trait that was noted during the Ramey murder investigation. Ultimately, both women's husbands are arrested and tried for their murders. In the case of Eula Phillips, it was uncovered that despite the couple's outward appearance, their marriage was not a happy one. It was said that Jimmy often drank and on multiple occasions had gotten quite rough with his wife. And it was also testified that Eula was having affairs behind her husband's back. It was theorized that he found out and he killed her. Now, this entire case was based on the fact that Jimmy was aware of these affairs. because it was determined that his own footprint did not match the print from the house, plus he had been attacked himself. Despite this story told by the hard evidence, though, the jury actually finds him guilty. But upon appeal, it's determined that Jimmy had zero knowledge of his wife's affairs. So the prosecution did not prove their case, and the verdict was reversed. Having no actual proof, the city opted not to retry Jimmy Phillips, and he was let go. In the case of Susan Hancock, her sister ends up coming forth with a letter she'd found from Susan to her husband, stating she had grown fearful of him in the past 2 to 3 years due to his drinking, and she was planning to take her daughter and move out. The prosecution cited this as the reason Moses turned on her. Moses and Susan's own daughter took the stand to say that while her mother had been unhappy with her father's drinking, she'd never given him that letter, and he'd never laid a finger on her in anger. So Moses' defense attorney were pressed to come up with a suspect other than Moses. And they put forth a black cook who worked at a local saloon named Nathan Elgin. In February of 1886, so a month and a half or so after the night of the double murder, Nathan Elgin was drinking in one of the saloons downtown. Elgin had a reputation for being a bit of a brawler and a troublemaker in general. And on this night, he's very drunk and he gets into a fight with a woman. He drags her outside into the street and he just starts wailing on her. He's beating the hell out of her. People pour out of the saloons to see what's going on, and Elgin drags this woman into a nearby house that I believe belonged to his brother. And bystanders can tell by her screams and the sounds coming from inside that house that he is killing her in there. Thankfully, someone has alerted the police, who arrive and enter the home, and in a confrontation, Elgin is shot in the chest and dies. After this, there are no more murders, break-ins, or assaults in the immediate Austin area that match that of the past 12 months' events. Plus, posthumously, it was noted that Elgin was missing the little toe from his right foot, just like the print recovered from the mud in the Mary Ramey murder and the bloody print from the Phillips home. Finally, in June 1887, Moses Hancock's trial is ultimately declared a mistrial, and they decide not to retry. Nathan Elgin cannot be tried. He's been dead for over a year and a half. And not a single soul has ever been held accountable as the Texas Servant Girl Annihilator. Now, in July of 1887, a full 18-plus months after the last murder and 250 miles north of Austin, there was an axe murder that takes place in the town of Gainesville, Texas. Once again, panic sweeps through Austin and the surrounding area, causing Texans to wonder, has Austin's famed axe murderer come to their town now? But it appears to be an isolated incident, and there are no further attacks. Some theorize that perhaps the Servant Girl Annihilator from Austin, Texas, pulled up stakes and moved their operation overseas to Whitechapel, London, England, and became Jack the Ripper. It's a compelling theory, I must say, but I don't think it's true. I agree with a number of experts that all of the Texas Servant Girl murders were carried out by the same person, and I believe it was Nathan Elgin. These theories are also backed up by a lot of very good modern case and profiling analysis that I will link to in the episode sources for you. I don't usually call out specific sources, but in this case, nearly all articles I read reference the book The Midnight Assassin by Skip Hollandsworth, whose research I relied heavily on for this episode. I also recommend the website servantgirlmurders.com and the accompanying book, The Servant Girl Murders, Austin, Texas, 1885 by J.R. Galloway. Also, a PBS History Detective Special Investigations episode titled The Texas Servant Girl Murders. If you head over to Instagram at A Good Night for a Murder, you can see a few victim photos plus some photos of early Victorian life in Austin, Texas. You can also see the photos and source links on the episode blog on my website at agoodnightforamurder.com. While you're there, you can sign up for the Good Night for a Murder newsletter. Each month I send out an episode roundup, reveal of next month's episodes, and other goodies like extra Victorian society tips, book recommendations, and more. For the bonus content for Housekeeper and Butler tier Patreons for this episode, we're going to poke a bit more at this theory that the Austin Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were the same person. Listen through the outro music to hear a short preview of this Patreon bonus content. To subscribe to Patreon and learn more about the podcast, you can visit agoodnightforamurder.com. Also, follow me on Instagram or TikTok at agoodnightforamurder. Please rate and review and share with friends. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again soon. To accompany Insanity episode 25 about the Texas Servant Girl Annihilator, we're going to take a closer look at the theory that the Texas Servant Girl Annihilator and Jack the Ripper were one and the same. As a refresher from the regular episode, the prevailing theory today regarding the identity of the Texas Servant Girl Annihilator is that it was a local cook named Nathan Elgin. This didn't come out until almost nearly 2 years after the murders had stopped, though. The theory was presented by the defense attorney of one of the last victims' husbands. Elgin had been shot and killed during a confrontation in which he was essentially beating a woman to death in the street, in front of people. After this, the murder stopped. Also after his death, it was discovered that Elgin had only 4 toes on his right foot. He was missing his pinky toe. And the footprints missing the pinky toe had been discovered at 2 crime scenes attributed to the Servant Girl Annihilator. But in July of 1887, in a town 250 miles away from Austin, a murder takes place that has many similarities to the murder spree in Austin between 1884 and 1885. Many fear that the Annihilator